So, what we're going to be looking at today, a blind spot in the church. Perhaps missing something in the Ten Commandments. Now, just to be very clear, by the church, I mean the whole Christian church. I don't mean Aberdeen Christian Fellowship. None of the incidents that I will be talking about later happened or had anything to do with Aberdeen Christian Fellowship. It's the general church I'm talking about. Now, just a health warning, some of the consequences of the blind spot that I am going to draw our attention to are extremely unpleasant, and hearing about them may be upsetting for some people. I'm sorry if you're upset, that's not my aim, but we deal with evil, with darkness, by bringing it into the light. And if anybody's upset by what I'm saying, just leave. People leave all the time to go to the toilet, to go to their kids. So just leave, and if it is upsetting and you need to talk to somebody, speak to me, speak to my wife Isabel, speak to somebody from the pastoral team. Okay, quick overview of where we're going. Just a very brief look at the Ten Commandments overall and their significance. So, the Ten Commandments, then I'm going to talk about the common oversight or blind spot in applying one commandment, and then we will look at some practical applications. So, quick overview of the Ten Commandments. Sorry that slide's small. I just tried to get them all in one slide. So, Ten Commandments, first mentioned in Exodus chapter 20, under the leadership of Moses and with God's miraculous intervention. The Israelites have escaped from cruel slavery in Egypt, and at Mount Sinai, in the Sinai desert, God gives instructions for how the people are to live in a way that is right for them as they are now God's people. So I'm going to read the relevant part of Exodus 20. So for brevity's sake, if you look at this in your Bible, there are some explanatory comments about some of the commandments. So Exodus 20. Then God gave the people all these instructions. I'm the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, from the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Okay, so just a few general points. Firstly, these commandments were given to the Israelites at Sinai after God had rescued them from Egypt. It's important that it's that way around. Secondly, God gives commandments not so that we might obey them and thus be saved, but as guidance for those who are already saved. Christians believe that salvation, whether from slavery in the Old Testament or from our sin and its consequences in the New Testament, that salvation is by God's grace. Good works are, of course, important. Otherwise, why would God be giving us laws or guidelines as to how to live? But good works cannot save us. Only God's grace, his free, unmerited love and mercy can save us. And then thirdly, with the exception of the Sabbath commandment, all 10 of the 10 commandments that are there in Exodus are restated in one way or another in the New Testament, and so therefore I think they still apply to New Testament believers, to Christians. Now, each command briefly states a general principle which has very wide application. The commandments were not given as a tick exercise in which we're trying to just do the minimum necessary to tick the box that we can get away with. No, the commandments were given as general principles to be fleshed out in 101 ways in our daily lives as God's people. And many of the other Old Testament commandments, and there are 613 of them, they flesh out that application of the 10 Commandments in family, social, economic, and political life. Now, of course, today we live in very different social circumstances from the Israelites in the desert when they first received the 10 Commandments, but I believe that God still expects us to try and apply these commandments to our daily lives. So, just to illustrate what I mean by that, let's just look at one of the commandments, 8th commandment, you must not steal. This does not just mean no shoplifting or burglary. It would also cover concealing income in your income tax return because you're thereby stealing from the government. It would mean failing to pay your workers if you're an employer or tradesmen that you've employed, failing to pay them their proper due. James 5 verse 4 in the New Testament, look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. And in one of the stories I'm going to tell later on, that verse kept ringing in my ears as we were working through the situation. Stealing would involve stealing from our employer by doing no work or doing our own work or playing on social media when we are being paid to work for our employer. Stealing would include overcharging customers, taking personal credit for some work that somebody else has done. It would include misusing the funds of a frail or demented person for whom we have got power of attorney. I've seen that numerous times. It would mean sharp practice in the distribution of a legacy. So, as I say, the commandments are not there to be used as a tick box exercise. We're not meant to try and calculate the minimum we can get away with. We're supposed to, before God, try to apply the principles he gives us to all areas of our lives. Okay, so that's the first section of the sermon. The second one is talking about a common oversight or blind spot in applying one commandment. So, 9th commandment in the NIV, you must not testify falsely against your neighbour, or perhaps you know and remember the old King James translation, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. Now, of course, that would include no false testimony in legal context, but it would also mean no lying about people in social contexts. It would mean no gossiping with the aim of destroying somebody's reputation. But today, I want to suggest to you that bearing false witness includes ignoring or failing to investigate credible reports of serious wrongdoing and behaving as though we have not been so informed. It includes withholding information we have which might help work out who is responsible for an evil situation. And to not be guilty of the previous one of taking credit, I got this idea from Dr. Carmen Imes, who's an Old Testament scholar. It's not my original idea. Now, suppose you're driving along and you've got Dashcam on and you witness a very serious accident. Somebody's maybe killed or seriously injured, or a vehicle is totaled. Police are having difficulty working out what exactly happened. Whose responsibility was it? Now, you are aware that your dashcam recorded the crash and you're a witness. You know that the crash, which has had desperate consequences, is entirely the fault of one driver. If in that circumstance you ignore the police appeals, then I would suggest to you that you would have responsibility for a reckless and dangerous driver going unpunished and maybe doing the same again. I think that such an instance would qualify as bearing false witness. God's character is a character of justice and righteousness and hatred of evil. That's there throughout Scripture. Here are some other passages away from what we've read in Exodus that emphasize this. Acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent, the Lord detests both. Proverbs. God hates it when the guilty get away with it. Psalm 97:10. Let those who love the Lord hate evil. Do we love the Lord enough to hate evil as he does? Now, an almost invariable factor in the seemingly endless series of scandals within the church has been a refusal to listen to early victims. Now, there have been lots of scandals and covered up evildoing in society out with the church. The post office scandal, the rape gang scandal, a series of scandals within the NHS. And in all of these situations, a common feature has been ignoring or silencing or vilifying those who have tried initially to draw attention to what was going on. But today I'm going to concentrate on wrongdoing in the church where action is not taken. Ravi Zacharias, whose picture is there, is perhaps one of the worst examples. He was a very famous evangelist with a worldwide ministry. He would debate with members of other religions and atheists, and he wrote many books about the gospel and how to share it, a couple of which I've read and found very helpful. He died of cancer in 2021. Some months after his death, an independent report published credible evidence of sexual misconduct involving probably hundreds of women, up to and including rape. In 2017, he had been involved in a so-called sexting relationship with a Canadian woman. The woman felt bad about it, wanted to tell her husband. Zacharias said he would commit suicide if she did. The woman tried to blow the whistle, and she was vilified by Christian leaders who characterized this as an attempt on her part to extort money, to blackmail Zacharias. And in fact, everything that Canadian woman was true, and many Christian leaders have had cause to hang their head in shame. And to their credit, some have publicly apologized for what they have done. then unless you've been living in Mars for the last 20 years, you cannot but be aware of multiple scandals where Catholic priests have sexually abused children within their parishes. And at least as bad as the individual cases of abuse have been members of the Catholic hierarchy's failure to investigate what was happening. In many cases, there would be children who would report what was happening. They would tell their parents would go to the local bishop, and the local bishop would remove the priest, but he'd just stick him in another parish where he would start abusing another group of kids. And this is not rare. I know of 2 relatives sexually abused as children in church contexts, one in a Catholic context, one in a Protestant context. 2 situations from our own experience. From 1988 to 95, Isabel and I were missionaries in Pakistan and lived there with our 3 kids. I worked as a doctor in a mission hospital in a shockingly poor area where healthcare provision was inadequate to a degree that those who have only been in Western countries simply cannot imagine. Women in labour would sometimes travel 2 days to get to our hospital. We needed visas to get into this Muslim country to do this work, and that needed the approval and signature of a Pakistani, and in our case, that was the local bishop of the Church of Pakistan. We worked alongside the Church of Pakistan, which was a union of most Protestant churches in Pakistan. In 1994, the bishop diverted funds given by German Christians to provide eye surgery for desperately poor people to save their sight. He took that money and gave it instead to a friend to buy lavish house furnishings. Now, possibly in a Western context, that does not sound a big deal. But let me say again, we're working in an area of extreme poverty. The vast majority of kids who came to our hospital were, by World Health Organization standards, malnourished, and diverting money meant that there's no eye surgery for poor people who may otherwise go blind, and that's being used to provide luxury for a pal. That's a big deal. The bishop simultaneously disbanded the hospital management committee, of which I was a member, creating a new one, including the recipient of the goods bought with the stolen money. Honest Pakistanis on the hospital staff were either sacked or bullied into accepting the new corrupt order. The diverted money meant that our Pakistani staff in the hospital, none of whom were rich, could not get their cost of living increase, which is a big deal when you are poor and inflation is running at 30%. Well, obviously, we objected to this, both there in Pakistan and to our mission internationally. Our local mission boss, an Australian called Sam, felt that we just had to accept what the bishop was doing, or there'd be no visas for missionaries. Worse than that, he promoted the lies concocted by the bishop to apparently justify his actions. The justifications were so ridiculous, I won't waste your time telling you them, but you can ask me later if you wish. So on behalf of our mission, someone came from Australia, supposedly to offer pastoral care to those missionaries involved in the hospital situation. She actually was a friend of Sam's, the guy who was taking the bishop's side in this. We reported what had happened, including Sam's part, to which her reply was, "That's not the Sam I know." In other words, I refuse to believe what you're telling me because Sam could not be guilty of that. Incidentally, when we came back to Scotland, I produced a 30-page, minutely referenced report of the corruption that had happened, and I sent it to all of our mission offices worldwide. Our international chairman, on receiving his copy, wrote back objecting to what I had written about him. I replied to him, and I cited the 3 times he was mentioned in the report, and I asked him which of those 3 he felt was unfair or inaccurate. And 30 years later, I await his response, which I think tells you something. And if you Google the bishop's name, you will find that there were multiple subsequent court cases involving he and family members stealing church property. The hospital was essentially destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were deprived of affordable healthcare, and undoubtedly many died. An evangelistic ministry collapsed, and our kids were damaged and devastated. Second one from my personal experience. This concerns an evangelical church here in Aberdeen, not one of which Isabel and I have ever been members, not Aberdeen Christian Fellowship. 15 years ago, a young woman who was a friend of Isabel reported to her how she had been sexually assaulted. She had been deliberately manipulated into a situation where she was very vulnerable by a man involved in Christian ministry to young people in the church, which they both attended. She sent an email regarding this episode, very detailed email, to the church leadership. No reasonable person could regard this email, which I've seen, as anything other than a report of a premeditated sexual assault. The church did no investigation into this grave allegation. The woman received no support, and indeed she got the message that the church leaders felt that she somehow shared responsibility, which was mortifying for her. Many months passed and no action was taken. So eventually Isabel and I sought a meeting with the church eldership about their inaction. They vehemently and angrily refused to accept any responsibility for their inaction and their wrong assumptions in the face of most serious allegations. Okay, I hope you're not too depressed, but I think that's enough evidence to make my case that the church is often guilty of bearing false witness by suppressing evidence of wrongdoing. So why might this be? Why do Christians fail to act when being alerted to possible abuse? Firstly then, Pollyanna syndrome. Pollyanna is a fictional character who always believes that everything is good and that people are good and their actions are always good. A frequent factor in the stories that I've shared has been an inability to believe that Christians or Christian leaders could do what is being reported or alleged. Thus, the friend of our boss, Sam, saying, "That's not the Sam I know," when we reported his evildoing. Thus, those Christians vilifying the Canadian woman who blew the whistle on Ravi Zacharias. And let's just be clear, unless you're with a person 24/7, 365 days a year, you cannot be certain that they are innocent of X, Y, or Z. Ravi Zacharias was having massive Christian meetings and writing great Christian books whilst being involved in criminal activity. Christian leaders believed that in Ravi Zacharias they were witnessing a fine, upstanding Christian, but they were wrong. Second reason why Christians may be inactive: fear of bad publicity damaging the image of the church. Sometimes those in leadership wrongly think that the church's public image is more important than righteousness and justice. Ravi Zacharias preyed upon his victims, saying to them that if what he was doing was publicly known, it would damage the cause of the gospel. Similarly, I think that some Catholic bishops didn't want the church's name to be tarnished by publicly taking action on the abuse of children by priests. Well, actually, they couldn't be more wrong. The Irish Republic, traditionally a strongly Catholic country, was particularly badly affected by this scandal. It has seen a catastrophic reduction in church attendance amongst Catholics, and the ability for the church to influence life in the Irish Republic has just been shattered, so that in recent years abortion and gay marriage have been legalized in the Irish Republic. Thirdly, fear of personal cost of getting involved. Now, of course, if we learn that something untoward is going on, it's much easier to shrug our shoulders and pretend that we haven't heard anything, or to believe the lies told by the perpetrators to cover their tracks. But Jesus invited his followers to take up their own crosses if they are to follow him. Perhaps for some of us, our own cross means getting involved in the messy and unpleasant business of exposing wrongdoing. I certainly haven't enjoyed my own involvement. Fourthly, inadequate hatred of evil or fear of God. We've seen that the Bible clearly portrays God as a God who hates evil, and his followers are called upon to hate evil as he does. Surely some of the failure to act in these circumstances, to tolerate or cover up evil, implies an inadequate development of our own godly character. And let's remember, God sees and hears everything we do and say, and we will one day stand before him. God is loving, kind, merciful, and forgiving. But he is also just and mighty, and to be rightly feared. Surely some of the cover-up behavior I've described shows a lack of respect for and fear of God. And then the fifth aspect, I think, is spiritual warfare. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. What Ravi Zacharias, an abusive Catholic priest, did was evil, as was what those who covered up for them. But they are not the ultimate baddies here. From the beginning, Satan's plan has been to destroy God's creation and destroy his witness on earth, in this age, the church. We can be sure that those Christians, especially Christian leaders, who've been involved in a pattern of wrongdoing, were targeted and tempted by Satan and his demons. Similarly, I'm certain that some of the inaction when people have learned of this stuff has been because of demonic intimidation. If we learn of something bad going on and we're trying to think, what do I do about this? We can be pretty certain that Satan will send demons to whisper in our ears, best do nothing. So-and-so's powerful, not somebody that you want to cross. Why disturb the church and its ministry? Oh, and by the way, remember that you are guilty of X. Who are you to try to clean up the church? Now, just to wind up this section, of course, this does not mean that all allegations must be automatically believed. Malicious or confused or unwell people make untrue allegations. And Christian leaders have been the victims of untrue, malicious allegations, as have people in public life, teachers, doctors, and so on. But this does mean that allegations shouldn't just be ignored or suppressed, but should be listened and properly investigated. Okay, third and final section, and we're at 12, so I'm just going to skip through this. Just a bit more about the fact that this is spiritual warfare. Word about confidentiality, that in general these matters need to be treated confidentially. We don't go gossiping. If, however, we're dealing with a situation that involves a minor or a vulnerable person, there may be legal and ethical reasons why, even if the person is saying, I'll tell you something, but you mustn't tell anybody, there are circumstances where we do need to breach confidentiality for the sake of whoever is being abused or other potential victims. If that's an issue, here are our safeguarding leads here at ACF, Donna Cuthell for kids and Jenny Smith for adults. And also here at ACF, we have got Annabel Turner, who founded CyberSafe Scotland. Lots of abuse that goes on nowadays is online. And Annabel, she's not here today, but she knows lots about this stuff. And if you have a question about online stuff, she is the person to speak to you about. Okay, back to football again. One of the wonderful stories of this World Cup has been Cape Verde. Tiny group of islands off the coast of Africa, never been to World Cup finals before, and they drew with Spain, and they had a magnificent performance against Argentina, the holders of the World Cup, where they held that team 3-2. They lost to Argentina, but they scored 2 goals, which is pretty fantastic. At the end of the game, obviously these Cape Verdeans were proud of their performance, but they were crying. And Gary Neville, one of the commentators, said, they're crying because this is so good and this is never going to get any better. And they don't want to leave. They don't want to go home. They want this to go on forever. So I've spoken about a lot of bad stuff, including bad stuff in the church. And to balance that, let's just look about how things end off. Ultimately, the goodies win. After this, I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. Unlike the Cape Verde team, we get to go home and be where it's as good as it possibly can be at the same time. Hope to see you there. Amen.